you, everyone, for coming out. I'd like to start off by acknowledging that we are in Mi'kmaq. This is the unceded and traditional territory of the Mi'kmaq people. This talk is called Heading for Extinction and What to Do About It. It was first given in the UK by Dr. Gail Bradbrook back in the fall. She's a molecular biophysicist. It's been given hundreds of times around the world now in dozens of countries. It's probably been given around a dozen times in Nova Scotia, everywhere from Lunenburg to Digby Neck to Sydney to all over. This will be the third talk in the Halifax area I think we've given. And this is the main means of spreading the Extinction Rebellion movement. We'll ask everyone, if you have questions, please hold them to the end. We'll have an extensive question discussion period at the end. This talk has two parts, basically. It's about 40 minutes long. The first part is about the climate crisis. What's the latest science? What are we really up against? What situation are we facing? What are we looking at? And part two is about the human response, how this affects all of us emotionally, and what our psychological response is to it, and what we can do as regular people to try to avert this crisis. Solutions that are drawn from, I guess, the study of sociology, the study of changes in policies and governments. As the original talk gives a lot of space for grief. Some of this information may be new to some folks, or the magnitude of the information, just processing it all, it can be quite a lot. So we will have a 2-minute kind of intermission moment of silence between the two parts for grief, for sharing. In the original talk, Dr. Bradbrook lets everyone know, feel free to hold the hand of the person next to you, have a cry if you feel the need. So we're going to talk about the precautionary principle, and we're going to talk about the kinds of information and the kinds of sources of information that are coming out of science and how they're getting to the public. So the precautionary principle is basically just the idea, if there's a really big risk, unless there's a really good reason to take it, you don't take it. So that's something that kind of applies to our decision-making in everyday life. It applies to policy-making in general. If there's a really huge risk and we don't need to take it, then we certainly shouldn't take it, unless there's some really special big reward we're after, of course. So we're going to kind of keep that in mind throughout the talk, I suppose. So the different information, the way that I guess the culture of science works, scientists are always trying to be extremely meticulous about the statements they make. They don't want to say does if they mean maybe, and they always try to be very careful that they're only saying things that they really know for certain to be the case. So what a scientist will tell you down at the pub over a pint about the data they've been dealing with will be very different from what they put in their paper that they're submitting for peer review. And then after the peer review, they have other scientists kind of look at the paper and say, you know what, I wouldn't say that exactly. Why don't we soften that statement a bit? And they go through it with a fine-tooth comb. And so by the time the paper is peer reviewed, it's even, you could say watered down, but even more kind of polished up, maybe less of the raw truth in there that the scientist might tell you down at the pub. And then at the last level there in the end, that would be the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. That's the IPCC. Many of you may have heard that an IPCC report came out back in November telling us that we have just 12 years to rapidly transform our energy systems away from fossil fuels, or we may face extinction of the human species. So even that report, that is even more conservative because it has other people, economists, and other kind of policy wonks involved in that. So what we're hearing from that, some have characterized it as highly politicized, but it's even more watered down in a sense. So traditionally they would be dividing kind of the range of scientific opinion up into like alarmist and middle of the road and highly politicized. The alarmist would be cherry picking data and saying things are going to be really awful. And the middle of the road, the mainstream science, would be kind of bridging the gap between that and the highly politicized conservative views. Now, in this talk, we're going to be looking at what the mainstream science is now saying. And what that's now saying is stuff that would have been regarded 20, 40 years ago as alarmist, but now the mainstream papers are saying these things. And that's what this talk will focus on. So just to give you an idea of how some of the predictions can be overly rosy, this chart shows us models of Arctic sea ice. So this measures the minimum Arctic sea ice, which happens in September because it's had all summer to melt and it hasn't started refreezing yet from colder weather. So in September, the Arctic ice is the smallest, and they can measure it in kilometers squared. So they've been doing that for a while, and they've had these projections for a while. So the black line in the middle is the average of all the models of where they thought Arctic sea ice was going to go. And these dotted lines on the outside, that's the range of the models. So we thought that Arctic sea ice was going to be around well into 2100. And here's the actual observations, is this red line in the middle. And as you can see, up until like through the 50s and most of the 60s and 70s, it's staying pretty close to the model. But lately it's shooting way down. And now that we're getting into 2000, we can say it's departed dramatically from the model. And we'll see soon that we're definitely not thinking it will be around in 2100. So this is Professor Hans-Joachim Schnellnhuber. He was for 20 years the head of the Potsdam Institute for Climate Impact Research, senior advisor to Pope Francis and to German Chancellor Angela Merkel and to the European Union. So just a very prestigious climate scientist. He had a recent paper called What Lies Beneath, the Understatement of Existential Climate Risk. And in that he says, climate change is now reaching the end game. The issue is the very survival of our civilization. In Dr. Bradbook's talk, she goes on to say that this paper talks about how climate change policymaking has become embedded in a culture of failure and scientific reticence. It argues for urgent risk reframe in the climate research in the IPCC reports, and it contains voices from some of the world's leading scientists. So as we get into the science here, we're going to talk about the temperature, we're going to talk about tipping points, feedback loops, and impacts. So those are the four things we're going to be kind of looking at here. So this is what Arctic sea ice is actually doing, and this is like kind of the latest models. The colored lines are different models, and the black line is what's actually happening. And this is for the same measure, the minimum, September minimum of Arctic sea ice. And as we can see, it now looks like it will be gone sometime early in the next decade. Well, why is that important? So this is kind of the first of the many tipping points that we hear about. There's something called the albedo effect. So the albedo effect means that when you have this ice, the ice is white, and white reflects light. So when the sunlight hits the ice, it reflects it back out, hopefully into the atmosphere, although some of it does bounce back now with the greenhouse gases. But the more that ice melts, the more of what is left is dark blue ocean, and that absorbs the light. And so that heats up the ocean more, and that causes the ice to melt more. And when more ice melts, there's less ice to reflect it, and so that causes the ocean to heat up even more. So it's called a positive feedback loop, although it's not positive for us at all. It's kind of a vicious circle. So this is the first of these tipping points, these points where we can't really get the ice back. Once we've lost too much, it triggers these effects that just build and snowball. The Yale Climate Connections group says climate change is not simply a matter of cause and effect, it's more like a vicious circle. So that was just one tipping point that we're looking at. Some of the things are not really showing up here. There's a map I can see on my screen. This is a map of the world here, but it's not really showing up on the projection for some reason. That's strange. But you can imagine this is North America, this is South America, this is the Alpine glaciers, the Indian monsoon season. It's kind of a Mercator projection. So these are all different kinds of tipping points. They were looked at in the paper called Hot House Earth. It was a PNS paper. And they talked about abrupt climate change due to these feedback loops. So not only do we need to worry about the Arctic ice going away, we're worried about the Antarctic ice sheet, we're worried about the Greenland ice sheet, the Amazon and the boreal forests. As climate change increases, we're going to see more forest fires, drier, hotter conditions. And when we have a forest fire, that releases massive amounts of carbon into the air. All the carbon that those trees are storing, when trees breathe in, they take in carbon and they store it. They're wonderful at that. But when they all burn up, it all goes back out into the air. So the more forest fires we have, then we get more and more carbon into the air. Some of you may have heard of the jet stream. This very warm water current that comes up from the Caribbean. And it normally goes right across over towards Europe, but it's starting to shift a bit. And if it shifts over here, we're going to get lots of water warming in around Halifax and in the Northumberland Strait. For example, lobster will have a hard time dealing with that. The lobster fishery is worth billions of dollars a year in Nova Scotia. We're going to be talking about some more of these effects down the road, but basically, as we get higher and our temperature increases, we're hitting more and more of these tipping points. And at a certain point, we've hit too many, and all of our best science will be, and all of our best technology, all of our best efforts will be unable to reverse the process. So with the temperature, how cooked are we already? Right now, we're at 1°C, roughly, 1 degree Celsius above pre-industrial levels. So 1 degree Celsius above, say, the 1830s, when the Industrial Revolution really took off and we really started burning a lot of coal and other fossil fuels for our energy needs. That's at 1°C, and every decade we're going up about 0.17 degrees. That's right now, that's an average. That will accelerate probably. So that's what we're looking at. Here you can see what the temperature has done since 1850. And you can see since 1950, it's really started to take off. And this will, if we keep going on our current course, it will get more and more rapid. The University of Washington, they did some emissions modeling and the UN warming estimates. They say keeping it at under 2 degrees Celsius by 2100 is unlikely at this point. On our current course, we have a 1% chance of hitting the Paris target of 1.5. That's 1.5 to stay alive, if you've heard that rhyme. We only have a 5% chance of keeping warming below 2 degrees Celsius. The likely range right now, if we don't make drastic changes, is between 2 and 4.9 degrees Celsius, and we simply don't know what's going to happen at that point. The consequences would be horrendous. So one of the issues you hear talked about a lot is the sea level rise. This study looked at the melting of the ice in Greenland and Antarctica. It found that we could be looking at a sea level rise of around 2 meters by 2100. So one of the huge issues with sea level rise, you can see from the map, and again, the outline, something doesn't like maps, isn't showing up great. That could displace up to 1 billion people, up to 1 in 9 people around the world. Human civilization for thousands of years, we tend to build our big settlements at the mouths of big rivers on the coast. It's just a great place for humans to settle. You have food from the sea and from the river. You have water, and water transport traditionally been one of the main ways of transport. So here we have massive major metropolises. There's a little dot for Halifax up there, and we're looking at 1 in 9 people being displaced. In the UK, they talked about this is 10% of the UK population. And we can see the problems that are already being caused by immigration crises, the political instability that results. There's some people in the UK talk, they mention, well, there's a certain percentage of the population that would want to say, well, all these migrants will just shut off our country and we're rich and, they can all fend for themselves. And even if we were to take that, kind of selfish view, we would have massive consequences just from the migration within our own countries, all the people being displaced. So in addition to climate change, in addition to all the carbon going into the air, we also have a host of other ecological crises that are kind of ongoing. One that you may have heard a good bit about is ocean acidification. It's set to double by 2100. It's already something like 30% up from where it started. And when the ocean gets more acidified, a lot of marine life cannot adapt in time. Certain crustaceans and shellfish, they simply cannot make their shells under those conditions. It's something like 1 in 9 people roughly in the world depend on ocean for their marine life for their food source. So this is going to have massive impact in that regard as well. We're also seeing soil pollution, air pollution, other water depletion. The UK, for example, estimated is 30 or 40 years away from fundamental loss of soil fertility. We have deforestation and habitat loss. So all of these other pressures are also combining with climate change. This is Dr. Marcia McNutt. She's 22nd president of the National Academy of Sciences, and she's former editor-in-chief of the journal Science. And in a 2013 Science editorial called Understanding the Cumulative Impacts of Climate Change and Other Ecological Pressures, she characterized the situation as even the most optimistic predictions are dire. So in the past, the Earth has had 5 major extinction events. Folks are probably most familiar with the event 65 million years ago, caused by the comet that landed near the Gulf of Mexico that destroyed the dinosaurs, except for the birds who survived. We also had the Permian-Triassic event. That was actually the worst one in history. It wiped out 97% of all life. That was around 250 million years ago. All of the events, except for the dinosaur one, were associated with rapid rise in these gases, CO2, and also other gases, methane, some kind of sulfides. So what we're doing right now to our planet is similar to the rate of increase in these gases that we saw during the Permian-Triassic extinction event. And that brings us to our next slide. Many of you may know we're currently living through what scientists are calling the 6th mass extinction. And this is also associated with a term called the Anthropocene. We have these terms for different geological epochs. When I was growing up, we were in the Holocene, or that's what they taught us in school. And now they're telling folks we are no longer in the Holocene, we're in the Anthropocene, the age caused by man, by humans. We have a quote here: biological annihilation being the ongoing 6th mass extinction, signaled by vertebrate population losses and declines. This is mainly caused by overpopulation and overconsumption, especially by the ultra-wealthy. The endangered species right now includes 1 in 4 mammals, 1 in 8 birds, and 1/3 of all amphibians, as well as 70% of the world's assessed plant life. Between 1970 and 2014, half of all monitored wildlife species in Canada had declined in abundance. This paper is called The Possibility of Human Extinction. It looked to kind of quantify the likelihood of human extinction given our current situation. And it set up these risk categories. 1.5 C of warming is dangerous. 3C is catastrophic. 5C is just completely unknown. And it said based right now, based on this 2.2 trillion tons of carbon dioxide that's already in the Earth's atmosphere, we have a 1 in 20 chance that that already poses an existential warming threat. And the author of the paper said, this is equivalent to having a 1 in 20 chance that the plane you are about to board will crash. We would never get on that plane with a 1 in 20 chance that it were going to come down. Yet we are willing to send our children and our grandchildren on that plane. Professor Jem Bendel, he's Professor of Sustainability Leadership at the University of Cumbria. He recently had a paper called Deep Adaptation. He characterized societal collapse as being inevitable and soon. Immense catastrophe is very likely with a massive loss of human life. Human extinction is possible, and other life extinction already happening on a vast scale. And he presented a talk, and it showed possible mechanisms leading to collapse in just 3 years' time. Those are possible mechanisms, but the mechanisms are there. And this is the kind of thing that would be on the news every night if we had like a really functioning democracy in media in the West. We would be hearing about this nonstop. You can imagine if a comet or a meteor were going to hit the Earth in 10 years and wipe us all out. This would be a huge story. It would be on the news every single night with updates on the progress. Politicians wouldn't be able to talk about anything else until they had a plan in place to deal with this. People who didn't believe in meteors would not get a lot of time and attention on the media. So one of the things XR does as well is lobby and pressure the media into covering the climate crisis. So all of this is a breeding ground for fascism, for authoritarianism, and for totalitarianism. And we can look at history and see that when there's times when people are worried about having enough food, when food prices are spiking, when there's massive migrations, when there's political instability, when there's disasters, this can be a breeding ground for certain groups to start scapegoating other groups and for people to do pretty horrible things to each other. At this point in the original talk, Dr. Bradbrook read some quotes about the treatment of, I believe it was Soviet prisoners of war during World War II by the Nazis. But we can kind of look through history. You can take any of these brutal incidents going back to the sack of Cremona by the Romans in 200 BC up to, say, the occupation of Nanking in World War II. These are all things that we need to be aware of. And many of us are aware that some of these undercurrents are already popping up in the West. So this is kind of interesting. This scientist has a blog called Survival of the Richest. Douglas Rushkoff. He's a professor of media theory and digital economics. And he was kind of propositioned by a group. They offered him about half his annual salary to fly out to a remote location and give a special talk on his expertise. So he flew out, and when he got there, he was surprised to see that there was not a big crowd of people or convention to hear him speak. It was just 5 men, elites from the hedge fund world, and they were not interested at all in his field of study per se, in any of the stuff he had prepared. They had very specific questions for him. They were building luxurious bunkers for what they call the event, and I guess the event is what some of the elite folks are calling this upcoming crisis, and they view it as inevitable at this point, I suppose. So they wanted to know, where should we build our bunker? Would it be better to build it in New Zealand or in Alaska? And what about security? Will there be technology ready in time to where we can have robot security guards to kill regular people if they come get in and try to get into our bunker and take our food? Or should we look at putting electronic shock collars on people who will put them on in exchange for access to our food and be our security guards? And they were a little puzzled that he was shocked at some of their attitudes and questions. So, government policy. At this point in the original talk, Dr. Bradbrook reads off some of the policies of the UK government that are completely out of line with the current science. So we can talk about Canadian federal policy right now. I should say that, in fairness, we're kind of in a situation where we can be making a lot of positive steps in the right direction, things that even would have been unthinkable 10 years ago, but still be falling woefully, woefully short of the very minimum we need to be doing. That's the situation we're in, and that's essentially what we're doing right now. We've seen some positive steps. Carbon pricing, we've seen some green support funds, scaling back of certain subsidies, such as for coal, but we're still woefully short of the minimum response needed to avert the crisis. Some examples: Canada still gives billions every year in taxpayer money to fossil fuel corporations. We lead the G7 in fossil fuel subsidies as a share of the economy. The IMF estimates our indirect fossil fuel subsidies at $34 billion a year. Despite being one of the wealthiest countries in the world, we're still among the top 10 villains in terms of fossil fuel production. There's a website called climateactiontracker.org, and they keep track of every country's progress on their Paris commitments. Here's a quote from the site. They say, Canada's current policies would be rated highly insufficient, and while full implementation of its planned policies under the Pan-Canadian framework would result in some improvement, they would still be insufficient. It says Canada must significantly enhance its efforts and proposed level of climate action to get onto an emissions pathway compatible with the Paris Agreement. In addition, our climate gap is actually getting worse. We had numbers released by Environment Canada. They show that we're on track to fall 79 megatons short of our 2030 greenhouse gas emission targets. And that's up. The previous year, it was 66 megatons falling short. So we're getting further away. And just for reference, that 79 megatons, that's roughly the output of Quebec. So it's like a third of our output. So that's federally. Nova Scotia, we can say a similar situation. We've seen steps in the right direction, but still woefully short. We've made positive steps in the past. A little over a decade ago, or around a decade ago, we committed to 40% renewables by 2020. We're roughly on track to do that. That's great. We also recently implemented the cap and trade system, which is not perfect, but better than nothing. However, again, these small steps are woefully inadequate given what we face. Some examples: in June of 2018, Nova Scotia announced it was spending $11 million in taxpayer money to support the offshore oil and gas sector. That's on top of $12 million it spent back in 2014. Nova Scotia is still the most coal-dependent province in the country, and we've made a special deal with the federal government to keep our coal plants open even longer than the rest of Canada, well into the 2030s. Nova Scotia Power is the private corporation that now controls our formerly public power grid. They plan to spend over $400 million to maintain and prolong the life of coal plants over the next 10 years. The Nova Scotia government rejected the 2030 bill that was supported by local environment groups that would have set stronger reduction targets for 2030, namely 50% of 1990 levels. They recently rejected a Green New Deal that was put forward by the NDP. It was called the Green Jobs Act. The Nova Scotia government website currently promotes us as a friendly place for fossil fuel extractors. One quote says, "In this section, you'll find out why the world's leading oil and gas companies are investing in Nova Scotia's offshore and how you can benefit from our vast petroleum potential too." We spent tens of thousands sending an 8-person delegation from the Nova Scotia government to an oil conference in Texas to court more fossil fuel extractors. I assume everyone has heard about the recent goings-on with the Alton Gas project yesterday. They actually arrested 3 grandmothers on the Alton Gas site. That's currently going on despite treaty rights and despite a lack of consultation and consent from local Mi'kmaq groups. That project would lock us into another decade of large-scale fossil fuel use and fracking. The Nova Scotia government has also asked Ottawa to allow fossil fuel drilling in marine protected areas. So, facing reality, a lack of concrete action. If we look back to the very first IPCC report, it was in 1990, 28 years ago. I was 12 years old. The UN warned us then, we need to keep the temperature rise to 1 degree Celsius or face societal collapse. We categorically ignored that. CO2 levels are now 60% higher than they were in 1990. Not only did we keep going, we threw even more fuel on the fire. They're still rising, methane even more so, and at some point we will not be able to reverse the problems. They'll run away from us. We can see kind of a visualization there. that at a certain point, if we get past 2C, it just goes, and there's nothing we can do to get it back. This is Professor Kevin Anderson, Professor of Energy and Climate Change at the University of Manchester, Deputy Director of the Tyndall Center for Climate Change Research. And here he's addressing one of the stalling tactics that has been used by kind of the fossil fuel industry and their allies in government is to say, we're going to have some technology to fix all this down the road. Sometimes they talk about carbon capture and storage. And this is the idea that we can burn coal or burn biomass, burn trees and forests, and we can actually capture the carbon in a machine and put it back in the ground. The problem is that technology is not ready. There's no indication that it will be ready in time. And he talks a bit about that and the difficulty in getting the science across to policymakers. We will rather question physics than the economic model, he says. Scientists are reluctant to say how challenging the Paris commitments are. Scientists are self-censoring. There's always going to be a silver bullet for the future. There have been a litany of technocratic frauds. We haven't tried real mitigation. Long-term targets undermine real mitigation today. And when he's talking about BECCS, that's carbon capture and storage, he says policymakers are relying on negative emissions technologies that don't exist. Kevin Anderson, about a year ago, he called for a massive World War II scale mobilization to transform our societies to renewables. And since then, we've seen those being put into policy packages and presented in legislatures. They haven't been taken up yet. They're now being called Green New Deals. So he was one of the first ones to propose that sort of thing recently. There's some people who have been talking about it for much longer, of course. This is Dr. Kate Marvel. She's with NASA's Goddard Institute, and she talks about human activity's effect on climate and what we can expect in the future. And she would go around to all these places and talk about climate change, and she would be asked, give us hope, say something hopeful about it. She says, to be a climate scientist is to be an active participant in a slow-motion horror show. We are inevitably sending our children to live on an unfamiliar planet. As a climate scientist, I'm often asked to talk about hope, particularly in the current political climate. Audiences want to be told that everything will be all right in the end. Climate change is bleak. The organizers always say, tell a happy story, give us hope. The problem is, I don't have any. And she goes on to say, hope is a creature of privilege. We know things will be lost, but it's comforting to believe that others will bear the brunt of it. But the opposite of hope is not despair, it's grief. Even while resolving to limit the damage, we can mourn. And here, the sheer scale of the problem provides a perverse comfort. We are in this together. The swiftness of the change, its scale and inevitability binds us all into one. Broken hearts trapped together under a warming atmosphere. We need courage, not hope. Grief, after all, is the cost of being alive. We are all fated to live lives shot through with sadness, and we are not worth less for it. Courage is the resolve to do well without the assurance of a happy ending. We'll now pause for 2 minutes of silence. So in part 2, we'll look at the human response to this information. Our emotional response, our psychological response, and the practical response. What do we do? How does this existential threat affect the way we wish to live our life? So this author is Stephen Jenkinson. We have some quotes. The meanings of life aren't inherited. What is inherited is the mandate to make meanings of life by how we live. The endings of life give life's meanings a chance to show. The beginning of the end of our order, our way, is now in view. This isn't punishment any more than dying is punishment for being born. Inattention to the world's ecological state is well advised, because attention to it mitigates against your happiness, contentment, your sense of well-being. So this is kind of the international slogan for Extinction Rebellion. Hope dies, action begins. It's the idea is that once you, I guess, give up on the idea of necessarily having a positive outcome, there's nothing left to do but everything we can to have the best possible outcome, and it spurs one to action. The local Nova Scotia chapter of Extinction Rebellion prefers first action, then hope. But it's a similar sentiment. So the good news is that technologically and economically we have the solutions. There's the Solutions Project out of Stanford, where these engineers have calculated how we can all shift to 100% renewables as quickly as possible, just using wind, water, storage, and solar, and no new hydro, just a pre-existing hydro. And the good news is we can do it. We can do it fast enough. We can start it right now, and it's economically completely doable. They've done all the calculations. The big missing piece to the puzzle is political will. How to create the political pressure to actually get that started. And that's what XR hopes to have an answer for. And the answer XR comes up with is nonviolent direct action, also known as civil disobedience. And this is something that has been shown again and again in history to be effective in creating rapid change, rapid shifts in policy against really immense power structures. Don't stand by, stand up. Yes? So traditionally in the climate movement, we all guess one of the common sentiments was, don't tell people how bad things really are, don't be too much doom and gloom, because that will kind of make people turn off, that'll make them not want to hear it. And that is a fear response. Psychologically, one fear response is just to kind of shrink up and hide, or put one's head in the sand. That's a natural human response to danger. But there's another natural human response to danger, and that is to leap into action, to get a big rush of adrenaline or what have you, and take immediate action to resolve the fear, to take care of the situation. And you can decide, everyone can decide what reaction you have, if you're going to stand by or stand up. We have a quote from Einstein: "The world is a dangerous place to live, not because of the people who are evil, but because of the people who don't do anything about it." There's a whole branch of psychology around this called altruism. It's very interesting. Yes. So, ethics. Yeah, what to do when your government is actively promoting the gassing of the world and driving extinction events. Yes, so back in the World Wars, some armies were experimenting with the use of poison gas. They used them on the front. And at the time, it was considered just completely evil. And it was one of the big things to spur other countries to actions. Look at how evil these people are. They're using this poisonous gas on people. And so, we have this very deep instinctive sense that that is evil. And so what if they were gassing a whole city or a whole country, or indeed an entire planet? And essentially our planet right now is being gassed. It's deliberate, it's willful, and it's planned. And Dr. Bradbrook notes in her talk, she says it's evil. And so what is the proper ethical response to this? And this cuts right across the political spectrum, whether you consider yourself liberal or progressive or conservative, that when governments fail to uphold the basic livelihoods of their people, that they become illegitimate, and it's the right and duty of the people to rebel. John Locke was a great liberal theorist. We might say progressive today because liberal is coming to meaning something else. He talked about the right of revolution. When the government fails to protect the lives and livelihoods of their citizens, as is the case in the climate crisis, people have a right to rebel. Thomas Hobbes was from a similar time period. He was a conservative theorist. He talked about the social contract. The state derives or loses its authority based on its willingness and ability to maintain order and security for its people. So this is something that cuts right across the political spectrum. And how do we rebel? Well, there's a lot of evidence that violence just isn't the way to go. A lot of us probably have an ethical and a moral objection to violence just because it hurts other people. But even if you don't, it's not effective. This is a quote from John Lennon. When it gets down to using violence, you are playing the system's game. The establishment will irritate you, pull your beard, flick your face to make you fight. Because once they've got you violent, they know how to handle you. You can be dismissed. The only thing they don't know how to handle is nonviolence and humor. And that's why Extinction Rebellion focuses on nonviolent direct action. And we have lots of examples in history of nonviolent direct action. This is suffragettes. They won the right to vote through nonviolent direct action. Over here on the top, we have Mohandas Gandhi. He took on the entire British Empire with nonviolent direct action. Nelson Mandela, I can't see him very well. There's Dr. King. We have Dr. King with the civil rights movement in the States more recently. Down here, this is a climate professor. He's getting arrested over climate change. Here we have a polar bear also getting arrested over climate change. So, Extinction Rebellion, we have a set of 3 simple demands. The first demand is that our key decision makers in government, but also the media and business, must tell the truth on climate change and must act accordingly. The second demand is that greenhouse gas emissions from all sectors must go to net zero by 2025. And the third demand is public oversight over the process, specifically a citizens' assembly to oversee the transition. Because if we let the same decision makers who have been doing everything up to now oversee the transition, it will not happen right. We see this right now. The European Union, in their renewables targets, they allowed biomass to be counted as renewables. But they allowed industry to define biomass and to implement how that was going to look. And that's why we're seeing a lot of clear cuts right now in Nova Scotia. A lot of our forests are being shipped over to Europe and thrown into incinerators and burned up. And it's being counted as renewable energy, even though it sets us back hugely for climate change. Some of those trees have been around for decades, and it will take decades for another tree to pull that carbon out of the air. And we don't have decades. We have 10 years to turn this around. Yes, so Extinction Rebellion aims to hold lots of nonviolent direct action events leading up to April 2019. That's now. So some of you may know that there's a large event planned for Monday here in Halifax. We'll talk about that soon. So the purpose of this, one of the main purposes, is to shift the Overton window. And this is what they call basically the range of what is acceptable public discourse, what we can say and talk about in public, and it's acceptable. So some examples is just 10 years ago, it would not be really thinkable for the leader of a Western democracy to talk about banning an entire religion from entering a country, or rounding up children and putting them in cages and that sort of thing. But the Overton window has shifted on that, and now large groups of, or a significant group of the population will now publicly, unashamedly say that they support those things, whereas in the past they would have had to keep that to themselves. So now we see the window shifting in another way as well. it's becoming more and more acceptable to talk about the facts around the climate crisis and what we all need to do about it as a society. Here's Dr. King again. We're going to go through some examples of successful nonviolent direct actions in the past. These are pictures of the Freedom Riders. The Freedom Riders were groups of mostly students who traveled down to Mississippi in the 1960s to try to integrate their bus system. You were not allowed to sit together on a bus in Mississippi unless you were of the same ethnicity to their mind at that time. So these folks would go down and they would sit together on the buses in mixed pairs of ethnicities. And dozens of them got arrested, but it worked. They integrated the bus system. And this is change that they brought in Mississippi in the 1960s. Yeah. So, yeah, some interesting comics about taking action, that sort of thing. Kind of pass through these. Yeah. So here's an action that was done recently in the UK. This Barclays Bank, they were going to fund a large fracking project in the UK. And I should mention as well, Extinction Rebellion does not endorse any kind of property damage for the same reason we don't endorse violence. This paint is chalk paint and it washes off. So at the end of the action, we wash the paint off ourselves. So they spray painted this hashtag on the side of the bank and they set up a tea table there. They took a picture of that and they shared it on Twitter. It got some tens of thousands of shares, and that resulted in this Barclays Bank pulling the plug on that project. They divested from that fracking project. Yes. Sometimes people talk about what are the consequences of getting arrested, and that's something important to talk about. Typically, if you're arrested for blocking traffic, you may just get taken in and released without charge within a couple hours. You may get kind of a municipal fine, in which case you would have to come back to court later and pay the fine. This gentleman here was on conditional release because he had done a similar thing a month or so earlier, and he was not allowed to do this again. That was part of his conditional release. So he laid down on one of the roadways going into Heathrow Airport to kind of protest a brand new runway. They were going to expand Heathrow Airport. That runway was going to account for some large number of new carbon emissions. So he laid down, he got arrested again, and the judge gave him a 25-pound fine and let him go. The judge was sympathetic with him. Just going to talk about some of these. Yeah, this is an interesting one. This was at, I believe, the London School of Economics, and the cleaning staff was just facing really horrible working conditions. It was to the point where they had to sleep on buses in order even to get shifts. So some of the students there said, this is ridiculous. These people shouldn't have to put up with this. We have all this privilege. We're the students here, so let's take the university to task over it. So they would do these pop-up street parties. They would do chalk paint on the street. They would take pictures of it. And after a few actions like this, Noam Chomsky retweeted one of their tweets. And within a week or so of that, the London School of Economics caved, and they gave in to all of the demands of the cleaning staff. Here, this is a divestment movement. Many of you may be aware that Divest Dow is a group who's been trying to get Dalhousie University to divest from fossil fuels for quite a while. It's a work in progress. The same thing was going on at King's College in London. This is Roger Hallen. He's a central figure with XR UK. There's some wonderful videos of him talking about the strategy and the ideas behind XR on the internet. His name's Roger Hallen. But this was an action they did. They did some spray painting and they took pictures calling on King's College to divest. And this is after years of doing campaigns, doing protests, and they said, okay, we'll create a committee, we'll prepare a report, and then the report's ready, and then we'll have a meeting about the report, and we'll create another committee, and it just goes on for years and nothing happens. So there was this campaign, and Roger also went on a hunger strike during this campaign. And within a few weeks, it worked, and they divested from fossil fuels. And this was replicated at other universities around the UK, Cardiff here, also divested after a similar campaign. Yes. Dr. Bradbook ends with another quote by Dr. Kate Marvel. She says, "Courage is the resolve to do well without the assurance of a happy ending." And Dr. Bradbook goes on to say, we're talking about traditional values oriented toward service to the community, duty, responsibility, honor, and the desire to be a worthy ancestor, in full understanding that we will die one day. It could be soon. Wishing to fully live a meaningful life, and in facing the risk of life on earth dying, to step forward and be willing to offer our service to something bigger than ourselves, to life itself. To some, this is a basic spiritual expression, the part of ourselves that understands what's sacred. So I'm asking you to take a minute to ask yourself, based on what we've just heard, what does it mean for me to be a good human? What does it mean to die without regret? Will you be able to look your grandchildren in the eye and say that you did what you could?